Star Citizen Shorts, Lost in the Verse. Tem watched the mining lasers firing short, probing blasts through the glass of his Aurora's cockpit. The light splayed across the dark asteroid belt, causing shafts of light and dark shadows to cascade in sequence with every burst. The ship out there mining was an Argol Mole, one of the premier ships for the purpose of industrial mining. By any standards, especially Tem's, it was a real gem of a ship. Flanked by two prospector mining vessels, it held position in the asteroid belt. The prospectors were also a ship Tem wouldn't pass up the chance on piloting. But for now, his trusty, albeit basic Aurora was his home, workspace, and transportation all. He took a deep breath on his cigarette, an outdated habit, and one that was doing real damage to his onboard air recyclers. He held the pull on the tobacco in his lungs. Carefully, he pinched off the lid end, ensuring the rest of the cigarette was recoverable for later relighting. The addiction was a constant drain on his resources, costing way too much to keep up, yet it made this tedious work possible. Tem wasn't making the UAC like he had imagined. The cost of living, even nomadic in its course, was expensive. He sat back in his chair, then let out a gasp of smoky air. The fumes spread out around his MFDs, the multifunctional displays. These readouts showcased just how dire his situation was. His fuel tanks held just over half in both quantanium fuel and in hydrogen. He shut his eyes against the future potential of his life and pushed through the bout of hopelessness. Then he grabbed his helmet and sealed the lid. The suit's air rushed through the vents and purged any smoke as the fresh air revived him. He triggered his seat's exit and rolled around, heading for the starboard side airlock. A quick check on his equipment told him that he was ready for a spacewalk. One last thing, he thought, pulling up his mobi-glass and sending a hailing communication to the mole, some thousands of meters away. Captain of the mole out there, Dem checked the ID of the mole and read aloud, Lackey. Then he mouthed the word, Lackey, with some confusion. Who would name their multi-million UEC? But his thoughts were drowned out by the return call from the mole. This is Captain of the Lackey, Leader Organization, Penrose Inc. Dan Lecky here. Go ahead, came the response. Tem mouthed an exaggerated "oh" with his mouth, and rolled his eyes. Org leader. Right. Then shook his head at himself, forestalling any preconceived opinions of the guy with a dismissive wave of his hand. Right, Lecky, this is the pilot of the Aurora, out a couple kilometers off your starboard bow. We see you, pilot. Our Defense Recon Force spied you on your jump in, said the disembodied voice of the Lecky's captain. Tem squinted his eyes and jerked his head up to look at the vast asteroid field. He hadn't seen any defensive forces, and he quickly moved back to his MFDs, checked the readouts again, as the captain continued with his transmission. I was going to hail you and ask you to stop your approach, but you seem to be holding now. As long as you keep it that way, there is plenty of space out here for the both of us. Tem listened to the captain as he visually scanned the asteroid field. Stealth ships, he involuntarily said aloud, only realizing that he had transmitted his thoughts via comm when the lucky captain returned with an affirmative to his question. I won't say more, but if you are scouting for any kind of low-life ambushers, just know that we have the firepower to ruin your day, said Lecky, with what Tem thought was a bit of over-the-top bravado. He nodded his head to himself. It made sense. The so-called stealth ships probably weren't even there. Either way, the scenario was favorable to Tem. If they had them, they would have done their work on him by now if they had wanted to. But it was just as likely, maybe even more so, that it was a ploy, and in the off chance that there were stealth fighters out there, well, they would keep any pirates busy while Tem made good on an escape route. He had no doubt that he would be targeted at a very low priority if things got out of hand. All in all, he had picked a pretty good place to work. No, Lecky, that isn't my intention at all, replied Tem, in hopefully a reassuring tone, just in case there were cannons pondering his existence somewhere out there. I merely wanted to let you know that I was about to EVA in my vicinity, and I wanted to check that your ops wouldn't bring you in this far. I don't want to get turned to mush by some trailing mining beam. Understood, pilot. We will avoid your ship with a good buffer. I'll make sure my crew steers clear. But if we find any Bexalite on scanner, the captain said with a chuckle, I can't guarantee anything. Bexalite, yeah, said Tem, fully aware that the chances were slim to none in these parts. That kind of load streak was 1 in 1,000, at any appreciable quantities. Just give me a heads up if you do, huh? Oh, absolutely, replied Lecky. Hey, pilot, we didn't catch your name. Tem. Just Tem, he said, hoping to avoid more conversation. Okay, Tem, let me invite you to our fleet comms. That way you can pay attention to any of our calls for fines and our movements after them. Tem sighed inwardly, but the offer seemed to have been made in the spirit of genuine aid. He couldn't really pass it up. It would look suspicious. Grimacing, he clicked over to the joint comms channel which had hailed him. Immediately, he jumped right into a heated argument between two miners about the benefits of selling ore outright versus the refinery processes. Just as he suspected. A real family unit, these guys. Each capable of insulting, attacking all other theories, and then forgetting the entire thing in seconds. Every small org was like this, Tem thought. Just the kind of thing he wanted to avoid. Chatter, debates, small talk, profit sharing. Tem dutifully allowed himself to be introduced to around a half a dozen miners. Noticeably, there were no fighter pilots on this link, but that really didn't mean anything. If there were any other channels, they would be locked, and he wanted to light another cigarette, get back into the groove for his spacewalk, forget the whole thing. It was one of the few things he lived for, the vast emptiness of space, the lone solitude of vacuum and the endless void beyond. It could really give you the sense that you were alone, take away the pressure of being a lone person among billions of others. All these channels open, well, minutes ago he had been encased in that veil of solitude. Now it was ruined with a pressing cacophony of voices on his comms. He shook his head. The day was getting on, and with no profits, there was no time for moping. Hey guys, I'm going to go for a spacewalk and need to concentrate. Sorry if I don't reply. I get pretty focused, Tem said stiffly. Okay, Tem. Welcome. We'll be here, was the insufferably cheerful reply of the captain. Tem turned on the volume of the fleet channel to nearly deafened levels. Then he spun up a synth track to keep his mind focused. Normally it would have, anyway. The constant chatter about yield results of hephaestonite and quantities thereof, outweighing the returns of rare, harder-to-find materials like regrisium through terranite, really blocked his mood. He punched the door release on the starboard exit, grasped both sides of the round opening, and he thrust himself into space, heading for the nearest asteroid, which held some deposits small enough for his personal multi-tool, or so he suspected. As he approached the rock face, a large boulder with a craggy surface, the deep fissures which ran along it were perfect locations to find the deposits that he was after. Really, that meant anything he could mine. He was not concerned with the positives of this material over that. Anything which netted UEC was his goal here. Enough for a bite to eat, maybe enough for a precious pack of cigarettes, if he was lucky. It didn't really matter. Being off ArcCorp was all the life's work he had ever dreamt of. He shuddered just thinking of his life back there, being pressed by throngs of faceless peons on a world so crowded you couldn't think without hearing someone else and their expression some kind of thought of their own. It had been maddening. Bracing himself, Tem grabbed hold of the rock, then whipped himself around in the direction of his momentum. He allowed a brief burst from his suit to slow his speed, and then the light on his helmet flickered on. The white light shone across the rock, and Tem dipped his head up and down, looking for the telltale flash of crystal reflections. Yet he was not so lucky. No seam appeared to be on the surface, so he began his visual inspection of the fissures and pockmarks which covered the rock. The first crevice held no fruits for his troubles, so he moved on, inspecting a tiny notch which ballooned out underneath the surface. He pulsed his multi-tool beam through the opening, and watched as light dazzled in the darkness. It reflected off that sought-after result of glassy crystal. Jackpot, Tem thought. Though it would be hard to reach. The opening had to be widened in order to get at the materials once his beam had broken apart the seam. But that was no matter. There was a payload inside this rock, and by the looks of it, Dolvine. The purple-blue reflection from his helm could just barely be made out in the deep hole. A good start on the day. Depending on how much was in there, a pry bar would break apart the thin rock crust which barred the passage to the recess. He quickly cut into the fleet communications to check on his celestial neighbors. The conversation was, of course, boring. They were talking for the sake of talking, trying to pass the time. Tem listened as he floated back to the ship. It was easy for him to find purchase for his feet as he angled himself towards his aurora. He secured his footing, launched himself, allowing a slight adjustment from his suit's thrusters to gain the door with practiced ease. He took only a few seconds to find his tool in the compartment by the bed. He all but burst out of the aurora's side door then, the exuberance taking hold of him as the thrill of a load strike fairly caught in his heart. He felt energized and attacked the surface of the rock, shielding the gems with a fury born of happy work. Several minutes later, he clicked off the annoying comm channel, piping through his helmet, and got lost in another track of heavy vibrations and electronic warbles of his favorite tunes. A few cracks appeared within the rock crust that Tem leveraged slightly, displacing their eons-old position with near effortlessness as the zero-G environment gave him extra abilities. They gave way to his manipulations, and he tossed them overhead with vigor, checking himself sheepishly as he realized that he had tossed them full on his aurora. He watched in mild consternation as they impacted his vessel. There was never really any worry of real damage, but he chided himself for it nonetheless. Although he planned on abandoning his ship at the first chance that he had to upgrade, really to anything, the trustworthy little ship would always hold a special place in his heart, being his salvation from ArcCorp and his home for the last few months of free living in the wilds of space. He couldn't really deny a sense of ownership for the thing. Why, he almost didn't want to leave it, upgrade money or not. It felt like home. He smiled slightly at the thought of keeping the Aurora in a hangar somewhere, as a prized trophy to show off when he became a big deal somewhere on an 890 jump, sipping the finest. Well, his breath caught in his chest. Beneath him, beneath the rock, was a veritable mine of hadanite. Tem checked his readout again on his tool. It wasn't Dolvine after all. It was hadanite. Practically a pure cell of wall-to-wall crystal, devoid of even a shred of rock inclusions. He almost let out the most wild cry of his life, but he realized that he was still in an open comm channel. He quickly tuned back into it. Now, all of his senses and paranoia which could be mustered focused on the would-be miners and their fancy ships and powerful beams mining nothing but what? Gold? Diamonds? Ha! The payout was right here, all his. "You can boost every job with consumables," stated one of the pilots as Tem listened back into the channel. He wasn't sure which, but vaguely had an idea it was a prospector pilot. An old hand on the crew either way. "The profit margin of every pulse of your laser has to be weighed with the potential gain and cost," he went on, the same way an exasperated teacher might explain to a grade school class. "Time is money," came a quick reply, and Tem knew the voice already, if not the name of the miner. A young, inexperienced new hire to the org. The voice was familiar because it was the same voice which constantly took a contrary opinion to any simple statement or fact, or thought in general. The consumables increase time savings at exponential rates. If you are mining something at all, then mining it quickly is the way to go. Maximize efficiency, and the cost balances itself out with the weight of volume. There was a slight pause, a quiet, drawn-out non-answer. Tem smiled to himself. This is why he avoided that kind of thing. The kid was a right wrench in the drives. But he was new, so everyone was tiptoeing around telling him outright to get in line. He shook his head, dreading the idea of being stuck on a ship with other people, and always weighing the social impact of his action and words. It was all too much. So he switched off the channel completely. Immediately he felt better. The droning chatter was gone. They were going on about nothing anyway. And the new kid was being a pest again, not mining the same rock as the other two mole turrets, which apparently made the job much harder. Either way, they weren't at all interested in his little speck of rock, their loss. He pulled his eyes away from the beam of light coming from the prospectors in the mall, the one wayward light beam still probing a rock away from the others. Whatever, Tem thought, and refocused on the task at hand. Now, the only question was how to load all of his material onto his Aurora. The cargo space was limited, to say the least. Well, it had no cargo space. Until now, Tem had relied on his suit's backpack cargo to hold his spoils. Still, so what if he just loaded up his bed with the stuff? He would fly carefully and take the risks. It would be worth it in the end, and he could be rich. Well, it was obvious what he had to do. He had to get mining. Hours passed as Tem cut away the gems from the rock wall and painstakingly stowed them away in his pack, then hauled them over to his ship once it was full. Taking a moment to remove his helm aboard the Aurora, Tem opened a snack bar pack. It wasn't bad, but he had been living off the same bars for days now, and he quickly chased it down with a spritz energy drink. His little Aurora was practically brimming with payload now. Well, his bed was overladen anyway, and certainly he had at least 100,000 AUC of gems by now. 100,000, with plenty more to be mined. It was perfect. Alone in the verse with nothing but his own daring, Tem had finally made it. He could rest and relax after this. The possibilities were endless. He turned to leave, and noticed the mole and prospector some distance away had moved to a new rock cluster. Their lasers were no doubt netting them all kinds of ores. Split up amongst them and their imaginary stealth guardians, plus the refinery stake, he figured it was probably equal, all told, what the profits must be in his. In fact, he may come out ahead of the day's work, and he had nobody to share it with. No fancy multi-million UEC fleet overhead either. Yet, any more daydreaming of potential future prospects were interrupted as his music ebbed into a normally relaxing flow of low-key vibes and pulses. The music cut out at the end of its playlist and he could hear the miners over it. The voices were coming from his shipboard communications audio system, which hadn't been turned off yet. This time they were discussing the strategies of mining for profit margins on the sizable end of the scale, which percentages of each ore netted what kind of outcomes. It was pretty dry stuff. Still, he had to admit, they were making good points and seemed to know their stuff. Despite himself, Tem listened to the talk as he munched on his power bar. Though he couldn't afford the kind of rigs that they were sporting, the knowledge might be handy one day. Sooner than later, he thought, glancing over at the pile of gems lying on his bed. He sat down in the pilot's seat and tried to stretch out, his bed being happily occupied. He lit the rest of his cigarette, this time without the compulsion to slow down. He could afford it now. Heck, he thought, and with a big smile he lit a new cigarette with the trailing end of the last. Smoking quick drags and really pulling on the valuable luxury, Tem listened to the captain of the mole, Lucky, as he went over valuable information on refining outputs and material yields. The entire crew was allowing themselves no interruptions. Likely they realized just how useful the tutoring was, and were smart enough to listen. Tem doubted they remembered that he was on the line, and he kept to himself. It wasn't the kind of information that was impossible to find, of course, but it was up to date and being delivered by a real foreman. He listened for a time, as gaps in his knowledge of the process were filled in, quickly disabusing of assumptions and clarifying bits he had only a faint grasp on from snippets of conversations here and there. About an hour had passed while Tem listened in on the impromptu class of basic refining techniques, and he was happy for it. You could never trust what someone told you, especially if they were hoping you would refine your ore at their station, or buy it at premier prices. This, however, was a genuine lesson meant to pass on knowledge to those willing to hear it. He shook his head wistfully as the dialogue ended. That kid had butted in and was now arguing a few points that he felt he had a stronger understanding about. Furrowing his brow, this time in annoyance, he was sure he wasn't the only one feeling it. Tem jammed a power button to his shipboard panel. The entire Aurora shut down. He sniffed loudly into the now dark interior of the vessel and moved for the exit. A few moments later, Tem was again besieging the Hadnite cluster. He had his music pounding in his ears and felt quite alone among the stars, with nothing but the asteroids for company. He was lost in the verse, as he called it, a preferable state of mind which noticed the passing of time not at all. In this state he felt endlessly energetic, able to really labor in the zero-G environment with a type of work that was accurate and vigorous. Though it had actually taken hours to collect the load strike, Tem had barely noticed the passing of time. In truth, he could scarcely be happier, even were he in a luxury liner, surrounded by sycophants and unable to calculate his credit holdings due to the sheer size of robust figures on his wallet. Yet that wouldn't stop him from trying to find himself in such a position, of course. He always had the potential to get lost in the verse. As long as he had that, he would be all right. It was in this state, slowly rotating within the asteroid, now half discarded and floating away at some 100-odd meters, that Tim saw an annoying flicker of light, as though something were casting a wide shadow over his ship and asteroid. He wiped his visor, clearing off the static dust clinging to it. He turned and looked to his right. The Aurora was nearby, now dead in space and powerless. It had listed away from his position, which he had originally set her. No big deal. He had to shut her down to avoid losing hydrogen, which he would need to maneuver into port. There was no problem there. He strained and turned again, holding firm to the asteroid, which was now at his back. The Lucky was close. The mining lasers were uncomfortably closer. They had moved into the cluster of asteroids just over a kilometer away from where Tem was still cutting out the less pure strains of Hadanite veins. Though not operating them, Tem could almost sense the power of those beams cutting away at rock. At his rock, with him on it. Tem keyed his communications suite in his helm. Tuned to the channel he had been invited to, and was quickly assaulted with a heated debate. Actually, it wasn't much of a debate at all. It was a verified verbal assault on everyone and anyone listening. The captain of the Lucky, normally composed and steady, was barely keeping it together on the word Gatling gun of the new hire kid. The kid wasn't letting anyone get a word in. Tem listened for a clue as to what had set him off. After a few moments it became clear that he felt entitled to the lion's share of the ore which the mole had just come over to mine. "I found it. I told us to come here and check the location. You all heard me," shouted the kid over the channel. Tem listened, not moving. He was in somewhat disbelief at the outrageous tone the greenhorn had towards his captain. Personally, Tem would never find himself subordinate to another man as captain and sovereign, pretty much judge and jury of his own ship. But if he ever did, he would know better than that. Tem's asteroid continued to drift, and now began spinning with him on the dark side. The mole, it was a black silhouette of sun just off its beam. "Lucky, Lucky, this is Tem. I say again, Tem here. Lucky," Tem called out to the mole, but the mole had gone silent. He checked his heads-up display. Everyone on the channel had been muted. Only the captain could use the comms on the channel now. Tem pursed his lips. It made sense, and Tem wasn't too worried. The mole hadn't been mining anything. Its mining lasers were silent. "Now listen here," stated Captain Lecky. "We took you out here to get your feet wet. Gave you a chance to prove yourself and make a bit of money. When you came aboard, I told you the rules that this order operates under. We split profits, plain and simple. Each of us takes a fair cut. There are no finders, keepers aboard this ship or in this fleet." Tem distractedly wondered what legal means the captain had at his disposal. He supposed they could shoot the guy and leave him floating in space, but he knew that was not the kind of crew operating the Lucky. Was it legal for a captain to execute members of his crew? No, Tem decided. Well, probably not anyway. It didn't seem necessary now, however. The greenhorn dutifully gave an apology, albeit obviously forced. Annoyed, Tem switched off his communications again, just after the captain announced his plan to tackle the new cluster of rocks. He terminated all incoming communications to focus on the last few pieces worth pulling off the rock. Tem was blissfully finishing up with his self-imposed perfectionism, cutting out every last square inch of Hadanite, no matter how low the yield. His rotation was bringing him around, enough to see the mole's lasers, roughly a kilometer away, as they beat upon the nearby asteroid. They, together with the two prospectors, were eagerly working on a new large asteroid, breaking it up into smaller pieces and again breaking them up in turn. But he was not looking. He was preoccupied with his nearly completed work. If he had been looking, he would have seen as the mining lasers of the mole winked out, all but one, its beam heavy and exact as it threw its power against an ever-increasingly unstable mass. Nearby, the two prospectors were working on busting up other rocks, and closely anchored to the mole's proximity with their mutual task. The asteroid was puffing and fissuring as eruptions across its surface melted out. The last mining laser cut off. A short time elapsed, and one of the prospectors began to feed power to its engines, leaving its laser on haphazardly as it began to put distance between itself and the mole, more specifically the unstable asteroid floating just below the nose of the Lucky. The explosion was enormous, and was followed by a concussive reaction of smaller explosions. It happened just as Tem had completed another rotation with his asteroid. He was now out of sight of the nearby operations. He failed to see the light flash upon the rock in front of him being on the dark side. Nor did he see the catastrophic results from which the explosion tore apart the Lucky and lower-positioned prospector. The Lucky, should Tem had seen it, seemed to increase in size as its main cargo hold ballooned and detonated, its drives and power cores going critical at nearly the same moment. Suddenly, its form inverted for a fraction of a second and shrank in the moment of total destruction. Then the brilliant reactor bloomed brighter even than that of the star which blazed at the center of the solar system behind it. The destruction of the Lucky, though intense, was overborne by that of the asteroids in the reactive chain. Such was the force released by the series of asteroids that the lower prospector's fate, though sealed, was nothing but a brief candle flicker in a roaring inferno. That lone prospector, whose pilot had managed to put some distance between themselves and the catastrophe, was still overcome with the event. Its shields flickered in a bright blue and purple field amongst the cacophony of colors, but winked out after being overwhelmed only moments later. Perhaps if the pilot had also had the intuition to divert all shields aft, in addition to the insight to flee at all speeds, they might not have been taken by the conflagration. As it was, the ship broke apart as it sped away from the blast nonetheless. Tem only knew of the danger seconds after the event. His aurora could be glimpsed in his peripheral vision whenever he pulled back from picking up pieces of cloudy howdenite. After taking a moment to wipe his visor with the detritus from which had been stirred up within the asteroid upon which he rode, he noticed the light on his ship was dazzling. He looked fully at the small little ship. The shadows from the sun were quite gone, and replaced with shimmering and piercing brilliance which displayed upon the hull. He leaned out, repositioned, and leaned further again, as he saw the epicenter of the blast, now less brilliant but expanding fast. A large piece of the Lecky, its four-beam turret, and crumpled cab were hurtling towards him. For a few heartbeats Tem watched as the blast came closer, traveling at hundreds of meters per second. He only had time to contemplate that he should have left minutes ago. Without thought, without hope, even a fool's hope, he switched to a communications suite and called out on the broadest band possible, something he never did. He called for help. Tem had no time even to finish his plea, let alone to see if someone had noticed. The debris of the Lecky had shot past his position at sickening proximity. It missed him and his lonely aurora, but it rode upon a blast wave of countless projectiles of both rocks and atomized debris. Other pieces of the ship, which held together, broke up upon his rock, slamming it into his helm. The crack which cut across his view was terrifying as the protective glass was fissured. He spun backwards and out of control, his senses too dizzy to begin arresting his momentum with his jets. Yet it was the sight of his ship which was truly sickening, and which nearly made him retch his stomach. He watched in horror as it, with its door wide open, spun out of control, bereft of power or cargo fields. His precious, meticulously collected hadnite spilled out in torrents as it drifted away, spinning. The spinning, along with the concussive blast, quickly overcame his consciousness. He faded out in the full realization that he probably would not wake up. He accepted this, but he raged in the realization that he had almost made it.